5 FIBA world records. Not career highlights, not tournament awards, not a collection of impressive moments stretched across multiple years of international competition. 5 separate, officially documented FIBA world records broken in a single game during the very first appearance Caitlin Clark ever made for the United States senior national team. Let that sink in for a second. Most players spend years working their way up through youth programs, development squads, and qualifying tournaments before they even get close to sniffing a senior national team roster. The ones who do make it typically need time to adjust. New systems, new teammates, different defensive schemes, the weight of representing an entire country on the biggest stage in international women's basketball. There's always a transition. There's always a period where even the most talented player in the room has to find their footing. Clark did not find her footing. She broke the floor. And the response from the head coaching staff of Team USA? Pulled her off the ball, shuffled the rotation, told every reporter who walked up to the podium that this is a team sport, that everyone on this roster is professional, and that shared minutes and distributed touches are what builds a winning program. What you are about to read is the story of how that philosophy fell apart. Slowly at first, then all at once. It is the story of a coaching staff that looked at historically documented evidence and chose ideology instead. It is the story of a player who never once went public with frustration, never dropped a passive-aggressive comment, never let the cameras catch anything other than professionalism, while the footage of what she was capable of told a completely different story with every single possession. And most importantly, it is the story of the interim coach who walked into a building mid-tournament, looked at all the same information everyone else had been looking at, and made one decision that produced a 55-point margin of victory, and then stood at a podium in front of every major media credential in the building and told the room exactly what had gone wrong before him. This is not speculation. This is not a narrative assembled from social media reactions and hot takes. This is what actually happened inside Team USA's FIBA qualifying campaign, what it means to the sport right now, and why the ripple effects of everything that unfolded in that tournament are still moving through women's basketball at every level. Let's get into it. When Caitlin Clark stepped on the floor for Team USA against Senegal, the conversation leading into the game was already complicated. There were people who believed she had been overlooked and underutilized by USA basketball for too long. There were people on the other side who argued that the senior national team program operated on a different standard, that roster decisions were made on the basis of international experience and proven track records at the elite level, and that Clark still had something to prove before the organization handed her keys. What nobody had fully prepared for was a possibility that she would make both sides of that argument irrelevant in the span of a single game. 5 FIBA world records. Not 5 impressive stats. Not 5 categories where she ranked near the top. 5 officially recognized records at the international governing body, level broken, during a debut, in a setting where the entire women's basketball world was watching with the kind of analytical intensity that gets applied to almost nothing else in this sport. To understand what that actually means, you have to understand what FIBA records represent. These are not numbers from a single league. These are benchmarks set across decades of international competition, across every women's basketball program on the planet that participates in FIBA-sanctioned events. The women who held these records before Clark were some of the most decorated international players the sport has ever produced. Some of those records had stood for years. Clark walked into her first game and dismantled them. Assists, efficiency, total statistical dominance at a level that international women's basketball had never recorded in a single appearance. And when you add the context, first game, senior level, 0 transition period, the magnitude of what happened against Senegal becomes almost difficult to process through a normal basketball framework. This was not a hot shooting night, where the ball kept finding the bottom of the net regardless of shot quality. This was not a situation where a weaker opponent happened to give up uncontested looks that inflated the numbers. This was a player demonstrating that she is the most complete offensive engine on the planet at the international level, doing it in a setting where every possession was tracked, analyzed, and measured against the entire history of the sport. The logical basketball response to that performance was obvious. You had just watched something that the sport had literally never seen before. You had a player on your roster who had just proven, with documented evidence, that she operates on a fundamentally different level than anyone else in the building. The move was straightforward. Build the offense around what just happened. Make Clark the engine. Get the other 4 players moving off her reads and creating opportunities downstream from her decision-making. That is not what happened. Kara Lawson came into this USA basketball qualifying campaign with a coaching philosophy she had been applying consistently. Equal distribution of the ball. Shared playing time across a roster full of accomplished professionals. A team identity built around the principle that no single player should define the group. In theory, that framework has genuine value. International basketball is won through chemistry, depth, and collective execution. No serious analyst argues against those principles in a vacuum. A roster full of WNBA professionals all contributing meaningfully is a more resilient team than one built entirely around a single star who, if defended effectively, can bring everything to a halt. The problem with that theory is what it requires you to ignore in practice. It requires you to look at 5 FIBA world records and decide that the player who just set them should be managed down in the next game to preserve rotation equity. It requires you to watch Clark operate as an offensive engine that has never been documented at this level before, and conclude that the more important philosophical commitment is making sure every player on the roster gets a fair share of the touches. It requires you to prioritize a system over the evidence the system itself is producing. When reporters started asking about Clark's role following the record-breaking debut, Lawson's responses were consistent. Every player on this roster is a starter in the WNBA. This is a team. Everyone deserves their time. These are not coaching adjustments. They are sentiment statements. And there is a meaningful difference between the two. A coaching adjustment addresses what is happening on the floor and why. It explains what specific defensive scheme the opponent is presenting, how Clark's role shifts in response, and what tactical decisions shape the rotation. A sentiment statement tells you how the coaching staff feels about fairness, about team culture, about the collective spirit of a shared endeavor. When the gap between sentiment and scoreboard becomes visible enough for the casual fan to spot it in real time, the conversation is no longer about philosophy. It is about results. The moment that crystallized everything for people watching at home came when a reporter asked Lawson a direct question about Clark's role in the offense. No ambiguity, no room to dodge, and Lawson did not answer it. She acknowledged the question, pivoted into team philosophy language, praised the collective willingness of the roster to sacrifice individual stats for a shared goal, and moved on to the next question. If you watch that press conference back-to-back with Clark's Senegal game footage, the disconnect was almost uncomfortable to sit with. The reporter asked about one specific player. Lawson talked about everyone on the roster. That kind of press conference answer does not happen by accident. It is a deliberate choice to not engage with the specifics of what was asked. And when that choice is made consistently across multiple media appearances in the wake of historically documented evidence on the other side of the equation, it stops looking like a communication style and starts looking like a position. Here's the part of this story that most mainstream coverage gloss over entirely, and without it, you are missing the full picture of what this conflict actually represents. Sitting on that same coaching staff, working in that same building, preparing for those same games, was Stephanie White, the head coach of the Indiana Fever, Caitlin Clark's professional head coach. The same Stephanie White who, across the 2025 WNBA regular season, ran an offensive system that frequently moved Clark off the ball, reduced her pick-and-roll initiations, and structured possessions around a more deliberate, committee-oriented approach. Think about what that alignment actually means in practice. You had two coaches, one running Team USA's qualifying campaign, one running Clark's WNBA franchise, both operating from the same foundational philosophy, both apparently more comfortable when Clark was doing less, both on the same staff, in the same building, implementing the same limiting framework on the most marketable and statistically productive player in the sport at the exact same moment. That is not a coincidence. That is not two separate coaches independently arriving at the same stylistic preference through completely different reasoning processes. That is a shared worldview applied simultaneously at two different levels of the same player's career by two people who are working together. When the most engaged section of the fan base started calling this the anti-Caitlin Clark plan, they were not reacting emotionally. They were identifying a documented pattern. that was producing measurable, visible results and not in a positive direction. The numbers were not ambiguous. The game footage was not open to interpretation. The pattern was there for anyone willing to look at it honestly. The question that started circulating everywhere, on basketball podcasts, across fan communities, in serious analytical spaces, was not whether this pattern existed. It clearly did. The question was whether it was intentional, whether it was a genuine strategic philosophy that both coaches believed in, or whether something more complicated was shaping the decisions being made around Clark at every level simultaneously. That question did not have a clean answer. And in the absence of a clean answer, the footage kept doing what footage does. It kept showing exactly what was happening every time Clark was given the freedom to run, and exactly what happened every time that freedom was taken away. Numbers in sports can be manipulated. Anyone who has spent real time analyzing basketball understands that context matters, that efficiency stats without possessions context are incomplete, that team numbers can reflect systems as much as individual talent. Serious analysis requires more than surface-level stat reading. With that fully acknowledged, what happened in this qualifying tournament did not require sophisticated manipulation to understand. It was visible to the naked eye in the stretches where Clark was running the offense, leading transition, pushing pace, initiating from the pick and roll, distributing from the top of the key. Team USA looked like the powerhouse program they were supposed to be. Assists elevated. Open shots materialized in rhythm, not through desperation at the end of a stagnant possession. Players who operate best in motion, best when their decisions are being made off of primary initiators' reads, looked exactly like the WNBA professionals they are. The team moved with purpose and efficiency that matched their talent level on paper. In the stretches where Clark was managed off the ball or sat entirely, the offense became something recognizably different. Half-court possessions that ran out of ideas before the shot clock reached 10. Ball movement that stalled mid-possession because the reads were not coming from a central initiator. A roster full of elite athletes, standing in spots waiting for something to happen that was not going to come from a distributed committee-based system. The contrast was not subtle. You did not need a statistical breakdown to feel it. You could watch for 30 seconds and understand what was missing. The Puerto Rico game was where this contrast became impossible to ignore. Zone defenses disrupted the offensive rhythm in ways at a pace and space. Clark-driven offense would have been specifically equipped to attack. Kickouts against the zone, quick passes that punish rotation gaps before the defense could recover, transition opportunities created by the aggression that Clark's game generates on its own. None of that was consistently available when the offense was running through a more measured, deliberate structure. After that game, Clark said something that anyone who had watched her career understood immediately. She said the team needed to play faster, that the ball needed to come out of the zone earlier. That pace was the answer to what the defense was presenting. She said it the way a professional says things when they're trying not to create a story. Measured words, neutral delivery, nothing that a headline writer could take out of context and turn into a direct criticism of the coaching staff. But anyone fluent in the language professional athletes use when they are diplomatically describing a situation that frustrates them, anyone who has spent real time, listen to how players talk about their roles when they cannot fully say what they mean, knew exactly what that comment was communicating. Let me run this offense. Stop taking it out of my hands. The team is better when I am the engine, and everyone knows it. She never said that directly. She never went public with frustration in any traceable, quotable way. No passive-aggressive post-game comments. No cryptic social media activity. No coded language in interviews designed to publicly pressure the coaching staff into a change. She showed up, played her minutes, posted her numbers, and let the footage make the argument for her, which it did every single game. Here is where the story stopped being about basketball philosophy and became something else entirely. Heading into the matchup against New Zealand, something happened that nobody on the outside had been prepared for. Kara Lawson was gone, not reassigned for a single game with a clearly stated tactical reason, not stepping back for a brief period with an explanation that USA basketball had the basic courtesy to communicate to the public, not sitting out with any kind of official statement released through any channel the organization controlled. She was simply not on the sideline. No announcement, no injury report, no press release. One day, She was at the podium navigating questions about Clark's role, delivering team philosophy answers that were generating more debate than they were settling. And the next day, the head coaching position was occupied by someone else entirely. To this day, the full circumstances of Lawson's departure from that tournament have not been made transparently public. That silence is not a neutral thing. It is not simply an organizational decision to keep internal matters private. In a setting where every coaching move is watched, analyzed, and discussed by a highly engaged national audience, unexplained absences do not stay unexplained in the public conversation. They become the story. And the specific story that the silence invited was obvious to anyone paying attention. The timing was too precise. The decision to remove Lawson from the sideline came at the exact moment when the tension between her rotation philosophy and the on-court results had become impossible to continue managing. The replacement made his most significant visible decision, starting Clark, before a single minute of action against New Zealand had been played. The direction change was immediate, complete, and public in a way that normal mid-tournament adjustments almost never are. When a head coach disappears from a major tournament with no explanation, and the interim who steps into vacancy immediately undoes the most visible and controversial decision her predecessor had been making, the timeline starts building its own narrative, whether anyone in the organization wants it to or not. The absence itself communicates something. The speed of a reversal communicates something. The decision to not explain any of it communicates something. That something is not a settled official account of what happened, but it is not nothing either. And in the absence of any official clarification, the most analytically engaged section of this audience will continue to draw the most logical conclusion available from the visible evidence, that the internal disagreement over how Caitlin Clark was being used had reached a point that the organization could no longer contain quietly. Into that vacuum stepped Nate Tibbetts, the head coach of the Phoenix Mercury. No transition period, no runway to ease into the role, no lengthy process of reviewing the previous coaching staff systems and philosophies before making changes. He walked into the building as Team USA's interim head coach and identified the most important personnel decision immediately available to him. Before a single possession of basketball had been played, he put Caitlin Clark in the starting lineup. There was no committee meeting about this, no philosophical debate about rotation equity or whether it was fair to the other players on the roster, no consideration of whether elevating Clark ahead of teammates who had more international experience might damage team chemistry. Tibbetts looked at the available information, the game footage, the box scores, the officially documented record-breaking evidence that had been sitting in front of everyone from the very first game, and made the most straightforward basketball decision the situation presented. The starting five he sent on the floor for the New Zealand game: Kelsey Plum, Caitlin Clark, Paige Buchers, Ryan Howard, and Angel Reese. 3 veterans with international experience who understood the demands of the specific competitive environment. 2 players whose individual games are specifically designed to reach maximum effectiveness when an elite pace-setting point guard is pushing transition and finding them in positions where their particular skills create the most damage. All 5 connecting to each other's skill sets in ways that required exactly 0 additional explanation. This was not an experimental lineup assembled through creative thinking. This was a coach looking at his personnel, understanding what each player does best, and designing a starting unit around the player whose game creates the most downstream value for everyone else on the floor. It was obvious. It was immediate. And the fact that it took an interim coach arriving mid-tournament under unclear circumstances to make it happen says something significant about what the previous approach had been prioritizing. Team USA defeated New Zealand 101-46, a 55-point margin of victory against an opponent that was not embarrassingly outmatched on paper, and that had prepared specifically for this game. Clark led the team in efficiency and assists, running the offense with the freedom and pace that her game is built around. Transition opportunities materialized at a rate the offense had not produced in any of the previous games under the prior coaching structure. The ball moved with purpose. Open looks appeared in rhythm rather than through late shot clock desperation. The offense produced points the way a functional, player-appropriate system is supposed to produce points, not through individual heroics overcoming a mismatched system, but through collective execution generated by a central initiator whose reads create opportunities for every other player on the floor. It looked, to anyone who had watched the previous games, like a different team had taken the floor entirely, not a different roster, not different individual talent levels. The same people in roles that actually made sense for what each of them does best, running at the pace the offense needed to run at a function, at the level everyone had known it was capable of reaching. But the defining moment of the entire qualifying campaign did not happen during the game. It happened after the buzzer. Nate Tibbetts walked to the podium and said something that coaches at his level almost never say. He acknowledged, publicly and directly, and without any of the diplomatic insulation that normally wraps these kinds of conversations, that the approach before him had not been working. He described the rotations as having been shuffled around too much. He said the group had not been given sufficient time to build chemistry as a consistent unit. He praised the starting lineup, Clark, Plum, Buchers, Reese, and Howard, by name, made clear that this combination represented the direction the team needed to build toward, and validated what each player in that group specifically contributed to the team's ability to function at this level. When a reporter asked him directly about Clark's role in the starting group, Tibbetts did not pivot into team philosophy language. He did not talk about collective sacrifice or how everyone on the roster deserves their time. He explained how the pieces connect. He validated what Clark brings to the offense when she is operating at full pace. He let the implication land without softening it or surrounding it with qualifications designed to protect everyone's feelings. He ate crow on live television. A sitting coach at a media podium with every major outlet covering the tournament, watching in real time, essentially confirmed that the staff before him had gotten the Caitlin Clark situation wrong. That does not happen in coaching circles. The unwritten rule across professional and international programs, a rule that is not written down anywhere, but is understood by everyone who operates inside these systems, is that you protect the staff before you. You use language that leaves room for multiple interpretations. You say things like, "We are still working through different combinations," or "Every game presents its own unique challenges." You find ways to communicate that changes are being made without specifically identifying what was broken or who was responsible for breaking. You do not stand in front of every major media credential in the building and effectively tell the room that your best player was being mismanaged. You do not name the lineup, name the player, name the specific adjustments, and leave zero ambiguity about what the comparison between the previous approach and your approach actually represents. Tibbetts did it anyway. And the reason it spread across every corner of the basketball conversation within hours of the press conference is not simply that it was an honest statement. Plenty of honest statements get made in sports, and nobody particularly cares. It spread because it confirmed what the most engaged, analytically serious segment of the audience had been saying for over a year. The system was not built for Caitlin Clark. It was built around philosophy that treated her as one piece of an equal puzzle, rather than as the engine the entire machine runs through. And the coaching community, which had largely watched the situation develop from professional distance, now had an on-the-record statement from an interim head coach, a peer, saying exactly that. The significance of who said it cannot be understated. This was not a fan. This was not an analyst on a podcast. This was not a former player offering a hot take on social media. This was a sitting coach in an active professional and international capacity with full understanding of what he was saying and to whom, making a direct public statement about the previous staff's approach to managing the best player on the roster. That kind of statement does not get walked back. It does not get softened in a follow-up interview. It is part of the permanent record now. And the permanent record is the thing that matters most when you're trying to understand what this moment actually represents for everyone involved. The data from this qualifying campaign is now fixed. It is documented. It is preserved in broadcast footage and box scores that anyone can access and analyze independently. When Clark is running the offense, setting the pace, initiating from pick and roll, threading passes that collapse an entire defensive structure before the rotation can recover, pushing transition at a speed that forces opponents to make defensive decisions before they are ready, Team USA functions at historically documented levels. The assist numbers, the efficiency numbers, the margin of victory, the pace and quality of the offense all reflect what a functional, properly structured program operating around its best player looks like. When the offense is restructured away from her, when the touches are redistributed, when the initiations are limited, when the pace is deliberately slowed to accommodate a more committee-based approach, the production drops in ways that are immediately visible to any informed observer, not subtly lower, visibly, noticeably, significantly lower in ways that affect the scoreboard in real time and not just in the statistical aftermath. This is not a narrative that advocates constructed after the fact to support a predetermined conclusion. This is documented evidence from the highest level of international women's basketball competition, produced over the course of a single qualifying campaign, accessible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. The coaching community cannot unsee this data. USA Basketball's front office cannot unsee it. The organizations that employ the coaches who made these decisions cannot unsee it. And most critically, Stephanie White, who is still the head coach of the Indiana Fever and who is still coaching Caitlin Clark every single day through a full WNBA regular season, cannot unsee it. The question that now hangs over every decision being made around Clark at every level is whether this data changes anything in practice, whether the documented evidence of what she produces when operating at full capacity and the equally documented evidence of what happens when that capacity is managed down actually travels back into professional ecosystems that generated the problem in the first place. The Indiana Fever roster, examined honestly, has real championship contending ingredients. Aaliyah Boston established herself during the 2025 WNBA season as one of the league's most reliable interior anchors. She draws defensive attention in a specific and valuable way. Her presence forces opposing coaches to commit help resources that leave other players in better positions, and she finishes at a rate that makes ignoring her inside presence an unsustainable defensive choice. That specific skill set in the right offensive system creates space downstream in exactly the areas where Clark does her most dangerous work. The synergy between a high-volume interior threat and an elite pick-and-roll initiator is not theoretical. It is one of the foundational offensive relationships in modern basketball. Boston and Clark, operating in a system genuinely built around what both of them do best, represents an offensive combination that most WNBA defenses would struggle to contain consistently. Sophie Cunningham brought something different to the roster, a competitive edge and shooting confidence off the wing that on her best nights elevated the offensive floor in ways that do not always show up in traditional stat categories. Cunningham, specifically, is precisely the type of player who becomes exponentially more dangerous in a Clark-led pace and space system. She does not need the ball in her hands to force a defensive adjustment. She spaces the floor. She plays with a physical intensity that raises the competitive temperature of everyone around her. Put her in an offense where Clark is pushing in transition and finding shooters before the defense can recover, and Cunningham becomes a matchup problem that opposing coaches have to account for in their game plan specifically. That combination has not been fully unlocked at the professional level yet. And the gap between what Indiana showed on their best nights in 2025 and what this team could look like with Clark consistently operating at the pace this qualifying tournament just documented, that gap is now a much harder conversation to avoid in any serious analysis of the franchise's trajectory, because the questions are no longer abstract. They were abstract before San Juan. They could be dismissed as speculation about potential, about hypothetical offensive systems, about what might happen if the coaching philosophy shifted in a particular direction. Those questions have answers now, documented, permanent answers. The same player operating under a different coaching framework produced a 55-point victory and multiple FIBA world records in the same tournament, where a previous framework produced stagnant half-court possessions and indirect but unmistakable comments from that same player about needing to play faster. The evidence is not sitting in the gray area anymore. It is sitting in a results column. The full story behind Kara Lawson's departure from this tournament has not been told publicly. Until it is, the speculation about whether internal disagreement over Clark's usage contributed to how that situation ended will continue to circulate because the timeline invites it, because the speed of the reversal following her absence suggests it, and because the absence of any official explanation leaves every interpretation equally available to anyone trying to read between the lines. If Lawson returns to the head coaching position at some point, if she reclaims the role, and moves to reinstall the rotation philosophy that characterized the early part of this campaign, then everything Tibbetts built becomes a debate rather than a settled conclusion. The chemistry of the starting lineup, the documented evidence of what this team looks like operating at full capacity, the on-the-record statements from the interim coach about what the previous approach had gotten wrong, all of that becomes material in a debate rather than a settled conclusion. That scenario, if it occurs, would tell you something significant about where USA Basketball's internal priorities actually sit, not where their public messaging says they sit, not what their official statements claim about prioritizing results and building toward 2028, but where they actually sit in practice when a decision with real consequences has to be made. The alternative is equally revealing. If Tibbetts is named permanent head coach, if the organization looks at the results of this qualifying campaign and concludes that the coaching approach that produced those results should be the coaching approach going forward, then the decision about Clark's role in the program is effectively settled in a way that cannot be quietly reversed without enormous public scrutiny. A permanent head coaching appointment following a record-breaking 55-point qualifying victory with Clark as a clear engine of the offense is a statement, not a verbal statement, not a press release, but a structural organizational statement about what USA basketball believes the Clark era is supposed to look like. There is a specific context that makes the coaching decision around this program more significant than it would be in any other Olympic cycle. The 2028 Olympics will be held in Los Angeles, a home Olympics, the largest domestic audience that women's basketball will ever play in front of, a moment that, if handled correctly, could fundamentally change the long-term commercial and cultural trajectory of the sport in the United States. The promotional infrastructure already in place around the WNBA, around Clark specifically, around the surge in attendance and viewership that the league has been experiencing, all of that will converge on a single Olympic stage in a way that women's basketball has genuinely never had access to before. The version of Team USA that just won by 55 points with Clark running the offense at full speed is a compelling early preview of what that program could look like on that stage. That is a version of Team USA that a home crowd in Los Angeles will show up to watch. That is the version that will generate the kind of broadcast numbers that change how networks and sponsors think about investing in women's basketball long-term. That is the version that translates the work of the last several years, the growing attention, the viral moments, the new generation of fans who came to the sport through Clark and have been staying because the product continues to deliver into something lasting. But only if the organization makes the right call about who is coaching it and how that coach is empowered to structure the roster around the evidence they have just been handed. A repeat of the early portion of this qualifying campaign. Equal distribution of touches, managed pace, philosophical team-first language delivered at press conferences while the scoreboard tells a different story would not just be a missed opportunity in a basketball sense. It would be a missed opportunity at the single most consequential moment in the modern history of women's basketball. The stakes are that specific, the timing is that precise, and the evidence of what works is that thoroughly documented. What Tibbetts proved in that single game against New Zealand is not a coaching theory anymore. It is a result, a documented, public, permanent result that now sits alongside all the other documented, public, permanent results in the record of this qualifying campaign, available for anyone to examine, reference, and draw conclusions from. When Clark is the engine, this team breaks records. When the engine is managed down, the production drops. The data does not bend around the philosophy. The philosophy is either responsive to the data or it is not. And in San Juan, it was not until it was, because the coach who chose not to be responsive to it was no longer on the sideline. Stephanie White is still coaching Clark every day. The 2026 Indiana Fever season is coming. The WNBA season will unfold under the same coaching staff that was present for all of this, both the stagnant half-court possessions and the record-breaking performances, both the team-first press, conference deflections, and the podium truth that Tibbetts delivered without apology or softening. White was in that building. She watched what happened when the approach changed. She heard what Tibbetts said about it publicly. The question is whether any of that changes the decisions made inside the Fever's practice facility when nobody is watching, whether the data from the international stage travels back into the day-to-day coaching environment in a way that actually shows up in how possessions are structured, whether Clark's 2026 season looks more like the record-breaking debut against Senegal and the 55-point demolition of New Zealand, or more like the stalled half-court sets and the coded comments about needing to play faster. That question does not have an answer yet, but it will. And when it does, the context from San Juan will be the frame that everyone uses to evaluate what the answer means. There is one chapter left in this story, and it has not been written yet. It will be written in the permanent head coaching decision for Team USA. It will be written in the 2026 Indiana Fever season. It will be written in whatever explanation, if any, eventually surfaces for why Kara Lawson was not on the sideline for the New Zealand game. It will be written in the organizational choices that USA Basketball makes between now and the opening ceremony of the Los Angeles Olympics. Every one of those decisions will be made against the backdrop of what happened in this qualifying tournament. Every analyst, every coach, every executive in women's basketball who is paying attention now has to account for the documented evidence of what the specific player produces when given the freedom to run an offense at full speed, and what happens to that same offense when the freedom is taken away. The sport has always had dominant players. It has always had players whose individual talent exceeded the systems they were placed in. What is different now is a public statement from an interim coach that confirmed on the record what the footage was already showing. The fact that this all unfolded at an international level in front of a global audience under the full scrutiny of every journalist and analyst with a media credential in the building. Narratives can be spun. Talking points can be developed. Philosophical frameworks can be deployed at press conferences to avoid engaging directly with uncomfortable questions. All of that is still technically available to anyone who wants to use it, but the data is permanent. The footage is permanent. The 55-point margin is permanent. The 5 FIBA world records from Game 1 are permanent. Tibbetts' podium statement is permanent. All of it now exists in the public record of the sport in a way that no organizational messaging can fully absorb. The question of what happens next is genuinely open, but the question of what the evidence shows has already been answered definitively, publicly, and in a way that women's basketball will be referencing for a very long time. The next decision from USA Basketball on the permanent head coaching position will tell you everything about whether this organization learned what the evidence in San Juan was trying to teach. Stay locked in, because when that announcement comes, the implications are going to run much deeper than a single roster move. And the Fever's first game of the 2026 season will be the first real-world test of whether any of this actually changed.